Welcome to this step-by-step bird painting tutorial in watercolour, and it's of this stunning, gorgeous willow tit bird, which I fell in love with the photograph and I just had to paint it. So I've actually sketched out an outline for the drawing on cold press paper with an HB pencil. For a full list of all the materials I'm using, please see the description below. You'll also find a link for the photograph and the colours that I'm using, and you'll find colour alternatives as well. So I've mixed up a puddle of burnt sienna, a puddle of raw sienna at the top there. And now I'm mixing the burnt sienna and Paynes grey together with lots and lots of water. So this is really pale, and this is going to be for the background. So make sure you mix plenty of paint. And I'm using my size 8 brush to mix these colours. This is ultramarine with a touch of burnt sienna. I'm going to put plenty of water in there as well. And it does make a beautiful grey, and it can be a good alternative as well to Paynes grey. I'm using my flat 1-inch soft head brush, and I'm just wetting this large section of the background. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint section by section, so you don't have to think about painting the whole background at once. So I'm just painting wet into wet the raw sienna to begin with, so the lightest colour. And I'm just sort of painting that randomly to the left there and to the right, and then dropping in the ultramarine mixed with the burnt sienna, damp into wet, so it doesn't run as much. And you've got that beautiful grey colour, and it'll start to spread as well. And I'm just painting slightly darker colour up against that little sort of clump of snow there on the right, so it'll really bring out the white of the snow. And I'm just using my size 8 brush just to smooth out some of the paint there, and I'm tilting as well to get the paint moving. Just adding a little bit more colour there just at the top using the raw sienna, and just adding a touch more of that raw sienna here and there, wet into wet with my size 8 brush. Adding a touch more of that ultramarine and burnt sienna mix to finish off that area. And I'm just wetting around the bird in the negative space there, and I'm also wetting the top of the bird's head where it's darkest. I'm also wetting underneath the bird as well. So here's a close-up here. I'm using creamy Paynes grey, and I'm painting damp into damp with my size 8 brush just to get a lovely soft sort of edge around the top of the bird's head there. Now, if it runs too much, I would suggest tilting your watercolour paper so it doesn't run up too much, so it runs down into the paint. So as you can see, I'm just carefully painting around the eye and just coming down into the lighter area of the bird. I'm just carefully painting around the bottom of the eye there, and just using the tip of my size 8 brush and just painting some sort of loose feathers just at the back of the head. And now I'm painting a very dilute wash of the ultramarine and burnt sienna mix, and painting wet into wet with my size 8 round brush. And I'm being very careful not to touch the body of the bird, because I want to make sure that he stays lovely and white around the edge there. So I'm just painting this large area to the right underneath the bird using that colour. You can use a diluted Paynes grey as well. So I'm just carefully painting around the bird here, wet into wet now, just dropping in a little bit, slightly creamier colour there, touch of the Paynes grey as well, damp into wet. And I'm just sort of painting very carefully around the beak. I have got my painting on a tilt there. I've got a framing tape. You can use masking tape just to tilt it. As you can see, there's a little circle just at the top there. I've just put it underneath my watercolour block. So I'm just smoothing out some of the washes there underneath, sort of blending, so you've got those lovely sort of shadowy marks in the distance. It's all quite misty, isn't it, in the distance? So again, just wetting another section now with my flat 1-inch brush, right up to that sort of little branch there. So it's just that area, and again dropping in some ultramarine with the burnt sienna. I do love that colour combination because you can vary it. You can make it slightly more blue grey or slightly more of a warmer grey, adding a touch more of that burnt sienna. Adding a little bit here of the raw sienna wet into wet, just for that lovely warm glow that you can see from the photograph, which I absolutely love. adding a touch more of that burnt sienna and ultramarine mix, wet into wet with my size 8 round brush, and just carefully painting around that bird. I don't want to touch his head, so I'm being very careful, and I don't want to touch his wing either. Now, if you're worried about painting the head wet into wet, as I did there, or damp into damp, you could do that wet on dry. So there are lots of different ways of approaching a watercolour. So I've just decided to do that to make him a little bit cute and fluffy almost, because I just love this picture. So I'm carefully just lifting off some paint there, just around the head area, so it doesn't bleed onto the head. So just sort of using a damp brush just to lift off any sort of puddles of paint there. So I'm working in this sort of top section, top left section here, wet into wet, painting the raw sienna first of all, rinsing my brush there, and then adding wet into wet, that mix of the ultramarine and burnt sienna, leaving the gaps so you can see that lovely warm glow of the raw sienna as well, and then just painting right up to the branches, painting a little bit darker because that's where there'll be some snow and it'll really show the snow off. And then I tilted my painting there to get the paint to mix a little and look a touch more atmospheric. Now you could let your painting dry here. I'm forging ahead. So I'm wetting the bird, but I'm being careful not to touch the background. What will happen if I get water in the background, I could get backrun. So if you're starting out in watercolour, I would suggest let everything dry and then work on wetting the bird. But everything's still damp here, and I'm just softening some of that dark there on the top of the head just to blend it slightly into the light area of the bird's face. And now I'm painting a very dilute burnt sienna and Paynes grey mixed. So it's really dilute. So I'm working light to dark, wet into wet, adding a little bit now of watered down raw sienna and painting that lovely warm colour that you can see on the bird there at the bottom. And this is still wet into wet. So all these very light colours to begin with, still using my size 8 brush. As you saw there, I dipped my brush into the Paynes grey. I think there's a little touch of burnt sienna in there as well, very dilute. But I took the excess paint off my paper towel just to control the amount of paint on my brush so it doesn't, all that colour doesn't run all into the raw sienna, so you can make sure these little patches of colour stay put. As you can see there, I've got a slightly darker colour there. I'm just painting the edge of the bird here with the tip of my brush, again taking the excess paint off on the paper towel to give me more control. And these dark colours could be a mixture of the burnt sienna with the ultramarine or the Paynes grey with the burnt sienna. So you get these sort of different sort of browns or dark grey browns or sort of bluey greys as well. So this is a little bit more now damp into damp, using the ultramarine and burnt sienna to paint sort of more individual marks there on the bird. Sort of working more now on mid-tonal value. This is a willow tit, I believe. I don't really know much about birds, but I just love birds. I love birds singing in the morning. They just sort of bring so much joy, especially when it's springtime. They're just the most gorgeous creatures and wonderful to paint in watercolour. So I'm using some Paynes grey here, really creamy dark Paynes grey, painting this dark underneath the beak, damp into damp with the tip of my size 8 brush. And as I come down a little bit further, of course, it gets lighter, so I'll make fewer marks. And just to create this sort of detail now, take your time, less is more. It's easy to get carried away, and in fact I do get a little bit carried away. I'm going to show you how I remedy that as well later in this tutorial, so don't worry. And these colours do lift off quite nicely, and lifting off is quite a nice technique to use to sort of describe the fluffiness of the feathers as well, the texture. So damp into damp here, painting these darks, building up gradually. I always keep looking at the reference photograph rather than relying on my memory, which is not always that great. But it's just because new things, you can see new things gradually, and just so keep looking at it so you'll get more accuracy that way. So I always say to my students, 90% drawing or painting and 10% looking. I know that's not easy. So even if you can do 60-40, you can get a better representational image because you're looking more. Drawing and painting is all about looking. And of course, then you can interpret it in your own way and use your own style and make it more abstract looking or more impressionistic. But it's just always good just to look at it, and you then can decide what you're going to do with that information. So I'm just blending with these dark colours because in this area it is a little bit darker. So again, still using the ultramarine and burnt sienna and gradually building up damp into damp. Just make sure your brush is the same consistency as the paper. If it's wetter, you'll get back runs. Now, there's nothing wrong with back runs. I love back runs, but if you just want this control here and sort of get the look of the feathers, you may not want to have a back run in the middle of your feathers. So I'm painting the eye here and I've left a highlight. I've used Paynes grey and I've used the tip of my brush. You can mask this out at the beginning with masking fluid, which I haven't done today. I've not used any masking fluid, or you can use white gouache later if you lose the highlight. So there's ways round things, as I said earlier. So I've painted some very pale colours on the sort of back feathers there, and just sort of now painting the legs and the feet. I'm keeping it really simple, just painting this pretty much wet on dry here, rinsing my brush, taking the excess water off, and then just paling this colour, this ultramarine burnt sienna colour, down to the actual sort of toes there where it's gripping onto the little branch, rinsing my brush again, taking the excess water off on a paper towel, and then just blending and smoothing the top of the leg into the body. And I'm going to do the same with his right leg, and I'm just painting this wet on dry, and then the sort of talons, etc. You can see that coming over the edge of the little branch there. So it's pretty much dry here, so I'm just painting these sort of mid-tone marks here, really taking my time just to see where the darks are. Sometimes you can half close your eyes as well. It blocks out all the details. You can just see where you need to paint those darks. So that's what I'm doing here on the wings, wet on dry. So he's starting to come to life just by adding these details. And I'm just darkening up some of these marks here and there. There's a little bit of dark on his tail and on the wings, and I'm just sort of painting a little bit more detail here now as well. Pretty much wet on dry. Haven't actually blow dried it, but it has dried off quite a bit here. If you're worried about that, always allow your painting to dry so you can paint the details. So I'm painting his beak here using the Paynes grey, just a little bit of dark underneath there, using the tip of my brush, trying to keep lots of light as well, adding a touch more dark to the tail, and I'm going to allow my painting to dry. So I'm actually rubbing out some of the pencil lines because where I painted the background, it crept over a little bit of the pencil lines where I was sort of marking out the snow. So the pencil lines are coming off quite nicely. If you're worried about pencil lines, you could use a watercolour pencil instead of an HB pencil, and that way that will dissolve a little bit in your background. Just use the same coloured pencil that your background is, something like the sort of a yellow ochre or something, so it'll blend into the background. So I'm mixing up some burnt sienna here and burnt sienna with a little bit of ultramarine, and I'm actually going to put some Paynes grey into that burnt sienna on the top right there. So I've got some lovely dark sort of brown colours, and this is going to be for the branches. I'm also mixing up some yellow with some Viridian here to make a green, and a touch of raw sienna as well, because I can actually see a little bit of moss on those branches. So I'm going to start off with that wet on dry with my size 8 brush, just here and there. Sort of a dry brush effect. And I'm using the burnt sienna now mixed with the Paynes grey, sort of just at the bottom of that little branch there, because obviously there's going to be snow on top. I'm going to give the illusion of snow just by leaving the white paper. Just mixing a touch more Paynes grey in there, taking that excess off, just to give a lovely dry brush effect, adding a touch of dark here and there. If you notice, I'm kind of using the middle of my brush, the belly of the brush, and not so much the tip, because you get more more dry brush effect, because there's that sort of tooth sort of texture on cold press paper, especially on rough paper. So it's quite nice. You can actually sort of catch the tooth of the paper to create some nice textures. And now I'm using the dark ultramarine mixed with the burnt sienna just to sort of push that dark paint up into the snow to create almost like a little tiny bit of shadow, and also bringing out a few little twiggy bits as well on this branch just to make it look natural. So try to sort of have light, mid and dark tonal values. Don't just have one flat tonal colour. It just makes everything look more interesting and actually kind of more realistic looking as well. So I'm just working my way along here using that dark creamy colour, pushing it underneath the snow, and then working my way just where the bird is, being careful here, I don't want to paint over his feet, and just working my way on to the foreground area, using sort of trying to kind of use quite fast brush movements there to create some texture there on that little branch. And I'm adding some darks now with the tip of my brush just here and there. And I'm just daubing a little bit of Paynes grey, sort of slightly creamier, just in different parts of that branch, just to really bring it to life. I've watered down that colour. It's this literally watered down Paynes grey, just painting underneath the branch that's going away to the top left there. Mixing up a touch of burnt sienna in there with a little bit of that Paynes grey, and just using the tip of my brush just to create a little bit more dark, but it's not as dark as that sort of foreground branch, because I want it to look like it's going off into the distance and it's a little bit paler, touch more mistier, etc. Just adding a pinch more dark here just as it's going away from that sort of main branch there, just to make it a little bit more interesting, and just a few little darks and details there, but just keep it slightly paler than the foreground branch. And what I'm doing now is I'm using a clean damp brush and just smoothing and blending that so it doesn't look as textured. Again, if it's very textured, it'll come forward more, so if I smooth and soften it a little bit with a damp brush, it'll look further away and it will create depth in my painting. So just adding a smidge more dark here as the sort of branch goes off in the distance there, using the tip of my size 8 brush. So working on the foreground branch here, there's a little bit more green that's showing, more moss. So I've painted that wet on dry at the bottom there, and now I'm using the Paynes grey and the burnt sienna and just painting underneath the branch there, wet on dry. There's a lot of snow here as well, and I want to create some real drama here with the darks and the texture as well. So as you can see, I've used a little bit of dry brush there to create some textures and darks to make the sort of marks come forward, using my plastic card to lift off as well to create sort of light and texture as well on the branches. And you do this when the paint is damp and not too wet. Unfortunately, the paint did dry a little bit, so I'm just wetting it or dampening it, allowing that to sort of dry off a little bit, and now I'm just lifting off again. It's coming off quite nicely, and it really does create lovely textures on the branch. So I lost my drawing slightly, so I'm just using my size 8 brush, and it's a damp brush, as you can see, and you can see watercolour isn't permanent, and you can actually lift it off, and that's what I'm doing here. I'm just sort of softening the paint with my brush, waking it up, working at that again, just lifting and just softening everything. It just waters down the paint, and you can just keep working at it, diluting your brush, lifting off with the paper towel just to get your light back. And it's working really nicely there. And you can actually use this as a bit of a technique. So I'm actually swapped now to a stencil brush. You can use a bristle brush just to really sort of get off darker areas here, just to shape the face a little bit more, especially if you've lost your light. But the lovely thing about this, it creates softness as well. So it's kind of a technique, lifting off technique, where you create this sort of fluffy softness of feathers or fur or something like that. And that's what I'm doing here. So I will go back in again, so don't worry, but it does create and shape the bird a little bit better. So I'm going to allow my painting to dry before I lift off the whole thing. So I'm going to paint some shadows in the snow. So I'm using some ultramarine with a tiny bit of burnt sienna, very watered down. I'm just sort of painting, sort of smudging some of the branch area there as well, but also painting this very sort of pale blue grey just next to it, so you can get your shadows there. I want to keep the top of the snow white, as much white as I can there, but just painting these sort of very pale shadows just here and there, still using my size 8 round brush. And you can see I'm really sort of scrubbing away, and I'm going to soften some of that branch there as well, so you don't have a hard edge. You can sort of soften and smooth it just to create some shadow on the snow as well, so you don't even have to use any colour there. You could just soften some of the branch colour with a clean damp brush just to create that illusion. I'm just going back in here on the right hand side with a little bit more ultramarine with a touch of the burnt sienna. They're just darkening up those shadows. So I'm just painting the beak here using my size 4 round brush. So I'm going for a little bit more detail now, and I'm just carefully reshaping the face, the top of the beak there, because obviously I lifted off this area earlier on, so it really gets me focused here just to draw in this detail, or paint it rather. I feel like I'm drawing though, because it's so sort of small little marks here, but I'm mostly using the ultramarine mixed with the burnt sienna, but you could use the burnt sienna mixed with the Paynes grey as well. And I'm just sort of painting little feathers sticking out of the top of the head here, all pretty much wet on dry, and make sure that sort of darker shadowy colours underneath the beak there, and just carefully shaping around the eye, carefully sort of painting the feathers on the right hand side of the head, and also a few little loose feathers coming out at the top of the head on the right there, using some Paynes grey here, really taking my time. And that's quite a sort of feat for me, because I'm always sort of painting so fast, but it's quite important just to get these details and remember to breathe. I think I did, because it's so tricky sometimes when you've got these small details. Try not to overwork it, almost sort of walk away sometimes if you feel you're kind of overworking your painting, and come back at a later time. But I'm just sort of painting some of the details just underneath the beak there where it's darkest, using some Paynes grey, tip of the size 4 brush there, pretty much again wet on dry, but a little bit damp into damp where I've previously painted a mark as well, but just carefully working my way round. Every mark is kind of important here. You want to keep the lights and also the shape of the bird, and I'm just lifting off some of the paint in the eye to create a touch more light in the eye as well there. And I'm going to use my paper towel to lift off the paint there, and as you can see there's a little bit more sparkle in his eye. This is a very watered down Paynes grey mixed with the burnt sienna, and I'm just sort of painting again on top of this area that I lifted off previously, adding some more of the feathers on the top of the wing there, a little bit more of the detail. So again, sort of working my way, sort of not so much light, but these are sort of more mid-tones, and I'll go darker, still using my size 4 round brush, using the burnt sienna with that Paynes grey. So just adding a little bit more darkened details on the legs and feet, and just painting a little bit more of that Paynes grey on the wing there, just picking out those darks and details. So I'm going to use some white gouache now. You can use white watercolour or even white acrylic. I'm taking the excess paint off on my brush. I'm literally using this straight from the tube. If you look at the photograph, there's a little bit of snow on the beak there, so I'm just sort of dry brushing that there, just little lights, and I'm just painting this little white outline around the eye as well. Now you could have actually used some masking fluid to do this, but I just wanted to just sort of paint this freely and then maybe add light and white if I needed to with the gouache. So I'm adding a tiny bit of water to that gouache. Sometimes it can be too creamy to paint with and it just gets it moving, but if you want to keep it really white and opaque, try to use as minimum amount of water as you can here. And I'm just really taking my time looking at where the little white lights are, you know, the light in the eye, on the feathers, etc., just to kind of really bring him to life. And I'm going to use a dry brush technique here for snow on the branches. They're just actually on those on the branch there. So using the belly of the brush, and this is a size 4 brush with the white gouache with no water in it, so it's creamy paint. If it comes off too thick, just wipe it on your paper towel to control it. And I'm just adding a little bit more white on this branch here where the snow's just caught the edge there on that branch. As you can see, I'm using the brush almost horizontally to create that lovely sparkly effect, doing the same here with that branch going away on the top left there. So it's just all these little finishing off things that really brings the painting to life. So this is a very watered down white, but not a wet brush. So I've taken all the excess on my paper towel, but it's just to add a little bit of light at the top of the bird's head there. And it's quite effective because it looks like a soft sheen. And I'm finishing off with a spatter. I'm spattering the branches just underneath it to make it look like snow as well. I'm really trying to restrain myself here. I don't want to go too mad with the spattering, and you certainly don't have to do it, but it's just a way of me finishing the painting. I've spattered the back of the bird as well. I thought it'd create some movement, and a few more spatters here and there to finish off. And I'm going to allow my painting to dry. I'm removing the washi tape to reveal a really nice white border, and it gives me time to see if I need to do any more to the painting. But I think I'll leave it there for now. Here's a close-up. He is gorgeous. I have thoroughly enjoyed painting him. If you have any questions about this tutorial, please put them in the comments section. And if you'd like to see more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to my channel where you'll get updates of my latest tutorials. And if you want to get access to my weekly exclusive tutorials, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? Details about the membership can be found in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. Happy bird painting. Bye for now.